Lieutenant Commander Natasha Kovalov never expected to perform surgery on herself while an alien watched in horror. But the universe had a peculiar sense of humor. The crystalline walls of Research Station Omega-7 reflected the harsh emergency lighting as she assessed the deep gash in her thigh, courtesy of a malfunctioning maintenance bot. Dr. Zix 427, the Centaurian chief xenobiologist, stood frozen in the doorway of the medical bay, all four of their bioluminescent eyes wide with shock. The metallic feathers along their neck bristled as Natasha calmly unpacked the emergency medical kit. Lieutenant Commander, this is highly irregular. Our medical AI will be online in approximately 47 minutes, Zix's translator chirped, their natural crystalline voice too complex for human ears. That's about 46 minutes too late, Natasha replied, cutting away the fabric around the wound. Blood pulsed steadily from the gash, and she could see muscle tissue exposed beneath. The maintenance bot's cutting laser had sliced clean through her environmental suit and deep into her flesh. The femoral artery's intact, but this needs immediate attention. Zix's feathers shifted colors rapidly, cycling through shades of distress. You cannot possibly intend to operate on yourself. That violates at least 17 safety protocols. Welcome to human medicine in the field, Natasha said, already threading a curved surgical needle. The station's medical bay was well equipped, but with the primary systems offline after the quantum surge, she had to work with basics. In the Russian Special Forces, this was part of our training. Never know when you'll be stuck somewhere without a medic. The Centaurian scientist moved closer, their natural curiosity apparently overcoming their horror. But the pain? You have no anesthetic. Pain is just information, Natasha said, positioning a light. Right now, that information is less important than stopping the bleeding. She took a deep breath, steadying her hands. The first stitch would be the worst. As she pushed the needle through her skin, Zix emitted a high-pitched keen that their translator couldn't process. Your vital signs should be spiking. Your stress hormones should be. How are you maintaining such stability? Natasha continued her work, each stitch precise despite the burning pain. Humans are adaptable. We evolved on a planet that tried to kill us in new ways every day. Sometimes you have to be your own doctor. She paused, wiping away blood with a sterile pad. Instead of standing there cataloging my biological responses, you could hand me that antiseptic spray. Zix hurried to comply, their movements jerky with agitation. The Foundation will need to revise their entire chapter on human pain tolerance. This contradicts centuries of xenobiological theory about consciousness and self-preservation instincts. Glad to help advance science, Natasha said through gritted teeth, finishing another stitch. But maybe save the academic discussion for after I'm done. The wound required 23 stitches in total. By the time Natasha tied off the last one, Zix had filled several data crystals with recordings and readings. The Centaurian hadn't stopped muttering about impossible neural patterns and revolutionary implications for evolutionary theory. There, Natasha said, applying a regenerative bandage over her handiwork. Not pretty, but it'll hold until the medical AI's back online. Now we can focus on getting the station's systems restored. You intend to return to work? Zix's feathers flashed with disbelief. After performing surgery on yourself. Natasha carefully tested her weight on the injured leg. The pain was manageable. The station's running on emergency power, half our systems are offline, and we've got 3 more maintenance bots that could malfunction. This isn't the time for bed rest. Humans are? Zix paused, their translator struggling to find the right words. You are magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. We get that a lot, Natasha said, already heading for the door. Come on, Doctor. You can study human resilience while we fix the quantum core. Just try not to look so horrified when I climb through the maintenance shafts with fresh stitches. Zix hurried after her, their feathers now cycling through shades of scientific excitement. This experience must be documented. The implications for emergency medical protocols alone. Lieutenant Commander, would you consent to a full neural scan once systems are restored? Only if you help me reach the upper access panel, Natasha countered, hiding a smile. Some things are still easier with 4 arms. As they made their way through the dimly lit corridors, Natasha could hear Zix composing research notes about human pain suppression and crisis response. The Centaurian still didn't understand that this wasn't about some extraordinary biological capability. It was simply what humans did: adapt, survive, and keep going, one stitch at a time. The news of Lieutenant Commander Kovalev's self-surgery spread through Research Station Omega 7 faster than a quantum surge. Within hours, the station's entire Centaurian medical team had assembled in their crystalline conference chamber, their feathers flickering with agitation as they reviewed Zix 427's recordings. Dr. Vex 392, the station's chief medical officer, replayed the footage for the 4th time. Their feathers had been stuck in a shade of disturbed purple for the past hour. This violates every principle of medical intervention we have established over 12 centuries of practice. Natasha sat at the far end of the conference table, calmly sipping her coffee while a dozen pairs of bioluminescent eyes studied her with a mixture of horror and fascination. Her freshly stitched leg throbbed beneath the table, but she kept her expression neutral. The human nervous system shouldn't allow for such precise motor control under extreme stress, Dr. Mix 156 stated, waving a data crystal. Our initial scans suggest Lieutenant Commander Kovalev's pain readings were high enough to incapacitate a Centaurian warrior caste member. Yet she not only remained conscious but performed microsurgery on herself, Zix added, their feathers now pulsing with excitement, and then immediately returned to station repairs. Natasha cleared her throat. You do realize I'm sitting right here? The Centaurian doctors startled, their feathers briefly synchronizing in embarrassment before resuming their individual patterns of agitation. Dr. Vex approached her, medical scanner humming. Lieutenant Commander, surely you understand our concern, Vex said, their translator struggling to convey their professional worry. Self-surgery is not merely dangerous, it demonstrates a fundamental disregard for established medical protocols. With respect, Doctor, Natasha replied, setting down her coffee, human medical protocols evolved under very different circumstances than yours. We can't always wait for ideal conditions. But the risk of error, of infection, Dr. Mix protested, is less than the risk of bleeding out while waiting for help, Natasha finished. Humans have been practicing emergency medicine on ourselves since before we had written language. It's not our first choice, but it's better than doing nothing. The conference chamber filled with the crystalline sound of multiple Centaurians trying to speak at once, their translators creating a cacophony of overlapping English phrases. Dr. Vex raised all 4 arms for silence. Perhaps, Vex said carefully, we should discuss the broader implications. Lieutenant Commander, would you be willing to participate in a comprehensive study of human emergency medical practices? Natasha leaned back in her chair, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at her stitches. You want to study how humans handle emergency medical situations. Your species' ability to override survival instincts and perform complex medical procedures under extreme stress could revolutionize emergency protocols throughout the galaxy, Zix explained, their feathers shimmering with academic enthusiasm. We've already begun compiling historical data, Dr. Mix added, projecting a holographic display. Humans performing emergency appendectomies in submarines, battlefield amputations, even brain surgery in Antarctic research stations. The sheer variety of conditions under which your species has successfully treated itself is unprecedented. Natasha watched as more examples appeared in the hologram, each one representing a moment when a human had faced death and decided to fight back with whatever tools were available. This isn't about special abilities or superior pain tolerance, she said quietly. It's about survival. But that's precisely what fascinates us, Vex responded, their feathers shifting to a thoughtful blue. Your species doesn't simply endure. You actively resist, adapt, and overcome biological imperatives that should render such actions impossible. The hologram shifted to show Natasha's own surgery, her steady hands working despite the severity of her injury. Most species evolve to avoid self-harm at all costs, Zix observed. Humans evolved to do whatever necessary to survive, even if it means cutting into their own flesh. You make it sound like we're some kind of biological anomaly, Natasha said, rubbing her thigh absently. Aren't you? Dr. Mix's feathers rippled with excitement. A species that can override its own pain responses, maintain fine motor control under extreme stress, and adapt to perform medical procedures on itself. The implications for emergency medicine are staggering. Natasha stood carefully, testing her weight on her injured leg. Well, if you want to study human resilience, you might want to wrap this up. The quantum core still needs repairs, and I promise to show Dr. Zix how humans handle maintenance in compromised environments. The Centaurian doctors erupted in protests, their feathers flashing warning colors. You cannot possibly return to physical labor with fresh sutures, Vex exclaimed. Watch me, Natasha replied with a slight smile. After all, isn't that what you're here to study? How humans keep going when logic says we should stop. As she limped toward the door, she heard Dr. Mix mutter to their colleagues, magnificent and terrifying indeed. Perhaps we should revise our definition of impossible when it comes to humans. Zix hurried after her, their feathers cycling through colors of concern and curiosity. The medical team will need days to process this data. Your species continues to defy our understanding of biological limitations. That's the thing about humans, Doctor, Natasha said as they entered the corridor. We've never been very good at accepting limitations. Now let me show you how we repair quantum machinery with improvised tools. Try not to have a medical crisis when I climb the maintenance shaft with one good leg. The quantum core's malfunction escalated faster than anyone expected. Natasha stood in the control room, watching as crimson warning lights painted the crystalline walls. Around her, Centaurian technicians moved in carefully choreographed patterns, their feathers pulsing with stress colors as they tried to contain the cascade failure. The containment field is degrading, Dr. Vex announced, their translator barely keeping up with their agitated clicks. At this rate, we have 17 minutes before total system collapse. Natasha studied the holographic display, her injured leg forgotten as she traced the spreading pattern of failures. The quantum surge had done more damage than they'd initially thought, corrupting the station's neural network and causing critical systems to turn against themselves. What about the automated repair protocols? She asked, already knowing the answer. Offline, Zix replied, their feathers a dull gray of despair. The medical AI, environmental controls, everything that requires quantum processing is failing. We're losing life support in sections 7 through 12. Natasha watched as another system turned red on the display. The Centaurians had built their technology around perfect, automated precision. But perfection had a weakness. When it failed completely. We need to reach the core manually, she said, moving toward the access hatch. If we can't fix it through the system, we'll have to do it the human way. Impossible, Dr. Mix protested, their feathers bristling. The core chamber is flooding with quantum radiation. Even our protective suits won't withstand direct exposure for more than a few minutes. Then we'll work fast. Natasha was already pulling on a radiation suit, checking the seals with practiced efficiency. Better a few minutes of exposure than watching the station tear itself apart. The Centaurian medical team erupted in protests, their translators creating a cacophony of warnings about radiation damage, cellular degradation, and the impossibility of precise work under such conditions. Natasha ignored them, focusing on gathering the tools she'd need. I'm going with you, Zix announced suddenly, their feathers shifting to a determined blue. The other Centaurians fell silent, staring at their colleague in shock. Dr. Vex began, the risk is necessary, Zix finished, already donning their own suit. Someone needs to document how humans manage the impossible. The journey to the core chamber was a nightmare of failing systems and emergency bulkheads. Natasha's injured leg screamed with every climb, but she pushed through the pain, leading Zix through maintenance shafts and emergency bypasses. The Centaurian scientist kept pace, their natural agility compensating for their unfamiliarity with manual navigation. When they reached the core chamber, the sight stopped even Natasha's breath for a moment. The quantum core, usually a perfect sphere of contained energy, had become a writhing mass of unstable light. Tendrils of quantum radiation lashed out randomly, leaving scorch marks on the reinforced walls. "The radiation levels are beyond survivable limits," Zix reported, their suit sensors screaming warnings. "We have perhaps 4 minutes before cellular damage becomes irreversible." "Then we'd better not waste time," Natasha said, pulling out her tools. "Hold this light steady and watch how humans handle impossible situations." Working on quantum technology while wearing radiation gear was like trying to perform surgery wearing oven mitts, but Natasha's hands remained steady. Each movement was precise, deliberate, guided by years of experience, and the simple knowledge that failure wasn't an option. "Your heart rate is elevated but stable," Zix observed, holding the light as instructed. "How are you maintaining such fine motor control through the pain?" "Same way I stitched myself up," Natasha grunted, bypassing another failed circuit. "Pain is just information. Right now, other information is more important." The radiation alarms grew more insistent as Natasha worked, but she tuned them out, focusing entirely on the task. Her world narrowed to the components under her hands, the sequence of repairs needed to bring the core back into alignment. 2 minutes until critical exposure," Zix warned, their feathers invisible beneath their suit but their voice tense with concern. "Almost there," Natasha muttered, making the final connections. "Sometimes you have to risk everything to save everything. That's another thing humans are good at." The core pulsed once, twice, and then suddenly snapped back into its perfect spherical form. The radiation levels began dropping immediately as the containment field reasserted itself. Around them, the station's systems began coming back online, one by one. Natasha sat back, exhaling slowly as the emergency lights switched to standard illumination. Her leg was throbbing, her hands were shaking from radiation exposure, but she managed a tired smile at Zix. "Still taking notes on human impossibilities, Doctor." Zix helped her stand, their grip gentle but sure. "I believe," they said carefully, "that we need to revise our entire understanding of what impossible means when humans are involved." As they made their way back to the medical bay for radiation treatment, Natasha could hear the Centaurian medical team already buzzing with new theories about human adaptability and crisis response. But she noticed that their tone had changed. There was less clinical fascination now, and more respect. "You know," Zix said as they helped her onto a treatment bed, "my species has always prided itself on finding perfect, automated solutions to every problem. But perhaps there's something to be said for the human approach, facing the impossible with nothing but determination and steady hands." "That's the thing about humans," Natasha replied, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of exhaustion. "We've never been very good at accepting impossible odds. Sometimes the messy solution is the only one that works." 1 week after the quantum core incident, Research Station Omega-7 had changed in subtle but significant ways. Natasha noticed it first in the medical bay, where Dr. Vex was teaching a group of Centaurian medical students how to perform emergency procedures without AI assistance. "Sometimes," Vex was saying, their feathers shifting in thoughtful patterns, "the most sophisticated solution may not be the most reliable one." The students watched in fascination as Vex demonstrated manual suturing techniques, their traditional reliance on automated systems giving way to a new appreciation for hands-on skills. Natasha paused in the doorway, her newly healed leg barely twinging as she leaned against the frame. The sight of Centaurians voluntarily practicing primitive medical techniques would have been unthinkable just days ago. "Quite a change, isn't it?" Zix appeared beside her, their feathers shimming with subtle pride. "Your influence has sparked quite the revolution in our medical protocols." Before Natasha could respond, the station's alert system activated. Not the blaring emergency sirens they'd heard during the quantum core failure, but a different tone. one that made every Centaurian's feathers instantly shift to alarm colors. Containment breach in xenobiology, the automated system announced. Biological hazard detected. All personnel clear Section 5 immediately. That's Dr. Mix's research lab, Zix said, their feathers paling. They were working with samples from the gas giant's upper atmosphere. Natasha was already moving, pulling up the station's schematics on her comm unit. What kind of containment systems are in place? Automated quarantine protocols, Zix replied, keeping pace. But after the quantum core incident, we can't be certain they'll function correctly. They reached the lab's observation window to find Dr. Mix trapped inside, their environmental suit visibly damaged. Through the reinforced glass, they could see the spreading cloud of iridescent particles, atmospheric microorganisms that had evolved to survive in the gas giant's hostile conditions. The quarantine field is holding, Vex announced, joining them with a medical team. But Dr. Mix's suit is compromised. The automated extraction system is offline, and these organisms, they're feeding on our standard protective materials. Natasha studied the scene, her mind racing through options. How long before those organisms breach Mix's suit completely? Minutes at most, Vex replied, their feathers cycling through distress patterns. We can't send in a rescue team. The organisms would consume their protective gear as well. What about unprotected entry? Natasha asked, already removing her jacket. The Centaurian medical team erupted in protests, but Zix raised their arms for silence. Explain your thinking, Lieutenant Commander. These organisms evolved to consume complex molecular structures, right? Like your advanced protective materials. Natasha was already rolling up her sleeves. But what about simple organic matter, human skin? Vex's feathers flickered rapidly as they processed the idea. The organisms are specifically adapted to break down complex polymers. Basic organic material might not interest them at all. Might not isn't certain, Zix pointed out, their feathers showing concern. Nothing's ever certain, Natasha replied, kicking off her boots. But sometimes you have to trust your gut and take the risk. How do we override the airlock? The next few minutes were a blur of activity. While the Centaurian medical team prepared emergency treatments for every possible outcome, Natasha stripped down to her basic uniform, removing anything the organisms might be attracted to. This violates every safety protocol we have, Vex said, but their feathers showed more anticipation than protest. Good thing I'm human then, Natasha replied with a grim smile. We've never been great at following protocols. The airlock cycled open, and Natasha stepped into the contaminated lab. The iridescent cloud swirled around her but showed no interest in her organic material. Dr. Mix's feathers were flashing emergency patterns as she approached. Don't move, she instructed, reaching them. These things like your suit, but they don't seem interested in human skin. We're going to do this the old-fashioned way. With careful movements, Natasha helped Mix out of their compromised suit, using her own body as a shield between the scientist and the consuming cloud. The organisms swarmed the abandoned protective gear, but ignored both human and Centaurian organic matter. When they finally cycled through decontamination and emerged into the clean area, the medical team was waiting with scanners and treatment options. But what struck Natasha most was the look in the Centaurian's eyes, not just amazement now, but something closer to understanding. You risked cellular dissolution, Mix said as they were being checked over, based on nothing but a theory and human instinct. Sometimes that's all you have, Natasha replied, submitting to her own scan. Humans have a long history of making impossible choices when there are lives on the line. Perhaps, Vex said, their feathers showing a new pattern Natasha hadn't seen before. It's time we stop thinking of human methods as primitive alternatives and start seeing them as valuable approaches in their own right. Zix nodded, their feathers glowing with what could only be described as respect. Your species' willingness to face the unknown, to risk everything on uncertain odds. It's not recklessness, is it? It's a different kind of intelligence altogether. We just call it being human, Natasha said, watching as the medical students began practicing manual decontamination procedures alongside their automated ones. But I'm glad you're starting to understand. 3 months after the quantum core incident, Lieutenant Commander Natasha Kovalov stood before the Centaurian Science Council, her dress uniform crisp despite the station's humid atmosphere. The council chamber's crystalline walls reflected the bioluminescent patterns of dozens of high-ranking Centaurian officials, their feathers creating an aurora of academic interest. Your report suggests a complete overhaul of our emergency response protocols, First Speaker Nix001 said, their feathers shifting in contemplative patterns. This is unprecedented. So was watching a human perform self-surgery, Dr. Zix added from their position beside Natasha. Their feathers had settled into a confident blue glow, so different from the alarmed patterns of their first meeting. Natasha activated the holographic display, showing footage from the past 3 months. Centaurian medical students practicing manual surgical techniques alongside automated procedures. Engineering teams learning to trust their instincts when technology faltered. The successful rescue of Dr. Mix from the contaminated lab. What we're proposing isn't about replacing your methods, Natasha explained. It's about combining the best of both approaches, your precision and our adaptability, your technology and our resilience. Dr. Vex stepped forward, their feathers pulsing with academic excitement. We've documented 47 instances where human emergency protocols provided solutions that our traditional methods couldn't match. The implications for space exploration alone are revolutionary. The council chamber filled with the crystalline sound of multiple Centaurians discussing simultaneously, their feathers creating waves of color across the walls. Natasha waited patiently, remembering how far they'd come from those first shocked reactions to her self-surgery. Your species continues to fascinate us, First Speaker Nix said when the chamber quieted. You embrace pain as information, treat impossible situations as challenges, and view protocols as guidelines rather than absolutes. By all logical standards, such an approach should lead to chaos. Instead, Zix interjected, it has consistently produced results that our most advanced systems couldn't achieve. Perhaps it's time we accepted that there's a logic to human illogic. Natasha suppressed a smile at the very human idiom coming from her Centaurian colleague. We don't ignore logic or precision, she said. We just understand that sometimes you need to adapt beyond your programming, whether that programming is technological or biological. The first speaker's feathers shifted to a color Natasha had never seen before, one that made the other council members straighten in attention. Lieutenant Commander Kovalov, are you familiar with our species' oldest philosophical text? I can't say that I am. There is a passage that speaks of the bridge between stars, a metaphorical connection that would unite different approaches to understanding the universe. The first speaker's feathers pulsed with ancient wisdom. For centuries, we believed this referred to our technological achievements. Now, I wonder if it wasn't predicting something else entirely. Natasha glanced at Zix, who nodded encouragingly. A bridge between our species. Between two ways of facing the unknown, Nix corrected. Your demonstration of human resilience has shown us that there are paths to knowledge we never considered. Perhaps it's time for both our species to learn new ways of walking those paths. The council chamber erupted in approving colors as the first speaker activated a different holographic display. It showed plans for a new joint training facility, where human and Centaurian approaches to emergency response would be taught side by side. The research station Omega-7 incident will be remembered as more than just a series of crisis responses, the first speaker announced. It marks the beginning of a new understanding between our peoples, one that recognizes that true advancement comes not from perfecting a single approach, but from learning to combine different ways of facing challenges. As the council session concluded, Natasha found herself surrounded by Centaurian scientists, their feathers showing patterns of excitement she'd learned to recognize over the past months. Dr. Mix was already discussing modifications to environmental suits based on human biological responses. Dr. Vex was scheduling a demonstration of emergency medical techniques for the next graduating class. "You've changed us," Zix said quietly as they walked through the station's corridors later. "Not just our protocols or our technology, but how we think about possibility itself." Natasha watched a group of Centaurian students practicing manual repairs while their automated systems ran diagnostics. "Maybe we've changed each other. Your species has taught us that precision and planning have their place. We've just helped you see that sometimes the messy human approach works too." "More than works," Zix replied, their feathers glowing with friendship, a color Natasha had come to know well. "It reminds us that the universe is too vast and varied for any single approach to be sufficient. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson humans have taught us, that true resilience comes not from perfecting one way of doing things, but from being willing to try new ways entirely." Natasha smiled, touching the barely visible scar on her leg, a reminder of where this journey had begun. "That's the thing about bridges," she said. "They don't just connect two points, they open up whole new paths forward." Above them, through the station's crystalline dome, the gas giant's swirling atmosphere painted patterns across the stars, patterns that looked remarkably like Centaurian feathers and human determination working together to write a new chapter in both their species' stories.